November 1944. A frozen road in the Eifel region of western Germany. A column of German Volksgrenadier infantry is moving toward the front. The men are on foot. Their boots are worn through at the soles. Behind them, straining against harnesses in the freezing mud, 6 draft horses drag a single 105mm howitzer. The wheels sink to the axle with every forward lurch. It takes 6 soldiers and a full hour just to hitch the team each morning. The horses are gaunt. They have been losing weight for weeks because the division cannot bring enough fodder forward. A hard-working draft horse needs roughly 26 pounds of total feed per day, grain and hay combined, with heavier artillery horses consuming over 30 pounds. A division's 5,000 horses required an estimated 50 to 60 tons of fodder every 24 hours. That feed must itself be hauled by more horses eating more feed. The supply chain is eating itself. Across this scene, on a parallel road a few hundred meters to the west, an American rifle company is passing, not on foot. Every single man in it is riding. Some are in the back of 2.5-ton trucks, the ones the Americans call the deuce and a half, sitting on wooden benches with their rifles between their knees. Others are in smaller 3/4-ton Dodge weapons carriers. Officers are in jeeps, the little 1/4-ton vehicles that seem to be everywhere in the American Army. Behind the rifle company comes another truck towing an anti-tank gun. Behind that, another truck loaded with ammunition crates. Behind that, a third truck carrying nothing but jerrycans of gasoline. Behind that, a 4th truck with rations and water. The American column passes in minutes. It is moving at roughly 25 miles per hour on a paved road. It will cover in a single hour a distance that the German division, on foot behind horse-drawn guns, will need 2 full days to march. This scene, or versions of it nearly identical, played out on roads across the Western Front throughout the autumn and winter of 1944. German officers and soldiers recorded the same observation again and again, in after-action reports, prisoner interrogations, and private letters. Where do the Americans get all those trucks? It was the question that the German army could not answer. And it was not really a question about trucks. It was a question about 2 countries, 2 industrial systems, and 2 entirely different relationships with the internal combustion engine. And the gap between those 2 relationships was so vast that no amount of tactical brilliance on the German side could close it. To understand why German soldiers on frozen roads in 1944 were staring in disbelief at American rifle companies riding past in trucks, we need to go back, not to D-Day, not to the American entry into the war, but to a factory in Highland Park, Michigan, in 1913, and to a man named Henry Ford, who set in motion the industrial revolution that would, 30 years later, put a truck under every squad in the United States Army, while the army that conquered France was still hitching horses to its guns. This is the story of how the United States won the war not with a secret weapon or a brilliant strategy, but with something so ordinary that most history books barely mention it: a truck, millions of them. And the story of why the army that built the Autobahn and invented the Blitzkrieg could never build enough of them. To grasp the scale of what happened in 1944, you need to understand something about America before the war that most people today do not fully appreciate. The United States was not merely a wealthy country, it was the country that had invented mass automobile ownership. In the late 1920s, the United States of America had more automobiles than Great Britain, Germany, France, and Italy combined. 80% of all the cars on Earth were on American roads. By 1929, there were nearly 27 million registered automobiles in the country, up from roughly 9 million at the start of the decade. 1 out of every 5 Americans owned a car. In Germany, by the mid-1930s, the ratio was closer to 1 in 50. The engine of this transformation was Henry Ford and his Model T. Between 1908 and 1927, Ford built more than 15 million of them. At peak production in 1923, the Highland Park and River Rouge plants were turning out more than 2 million cars in a single year. By the mid-1920s, the factories were reaching rates of 9,000 to 10,000 cars a day at their fastest. The price of a Model T runabout fell from $850 in 1908 to as low as $260 by the mid-1920s. A working man could buy one with a few months of wages, and millions of working men did. By 1926, half the cars on American roads were Fords. But the Model T did something more important than putting cars in driveways. It created an entire industrial ecosystem. By 1929, the number of American automobile manufacturers had consolidated from 253 companies in 1908 down to 44, with roughly 80% of all production concentrated in 3 corporations: Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. Between them, these companies employed hundreds of thousands of workers, operated dozens of factories, and had mastered the mass production of engines, transmissions, axles, electrical systems, tires, and body panels at a scale no other nation on Earth could approach. By 1936, the United States was producing roughly 77% of all the motor vehicles manufactured on the planet. Germany produced less than 5%. Those numbers are not a footnote. They are the entire explanation for what happened on the roads of France in 1944. Because the Model T and its successors did not just build an industry, they built a population, a nation of drivers, a nation of mechanics, a nation of men who had grown up around internal combustion engines, who had changed tires on country roads, who had rebuilt carburetors on kitchen tables, who understood gear ratios and spark timing and the difference between a 6-volt and a 12-volt electrical system, not because they had been to engineering school, but because that was what you did on a Saturday afternoon in rural Indiana, or in a garage in New Jersey, or in a barn in Montana, where the tractor would not start and no dealer was within 50 miles. When the United States Army began mobilizing in 1940, it inherited this population. It did not need to teach most of its recruits how to drive. They already knew. It did not need to teach them basic vehicle maintenance. They had been doing it since they were 14. The Army's challenge was not creating a motorized force from scratch. Its challenge was converting the largest automobile industry in human history from making sedans and pickup trucks into making military cargo vehicles. And the conversion happened with a speed that stunned even the men running it. Within 10 weeks of Pearl Harbor, civilian automobile production in the United States was halted entirely. The last civilian car rolled off the line in February of 1942. Every major car manufacturer in the country pivoted to war production: Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, Willys-Overland, Studebaker, Dodge. The factories that had been producing Chevrolet sedans and Ford coupes were now producing military trucks 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The results were staggering. Over the course of the war, American factories produced roughly 2,400,000 military trucks. They produced approximately 640,000 Jeeps. General Motors alone, through its GMC and Chevrolet divisions, built more than 850,000 military trucks, including about 562,000 of the famous Deuce and a Half. The GMC-CCKW, a 2.5-ton 6-wheel drive cargo truck that General Dwight Eisenhower, in his memoir Crusade in Europe, listed alongside the bulldozer, the Jeep, and the C-47 transport airplane, as among the 4 pieces of equipment most vital to Allied success in Africa and Europe. Alongside the trucks, GMC built over 21,000 DUKW, amphibious trucks, the vehicles the soldiers called ducks, which could drive off a ship into the ocean, motor to a beach, and then drive up onto land and deliver their cargo without ever being unloaded. No other nation built anything like them. The Dodge division of Chrysler produced over 250,000 3/4-ton 4-wheel drive vehicles in the WC series, light trucks that served as weapons carriers, ambulances, command cars, and reconnaissance vehicles. Studebaker built nearly 220,000 of its US-6 2.5-ton trucks, almost all of them destined for the Soviet Union. Every one of these vehicles was built to a standardized design, which meant that a mechanic trained on a deuce and a half in Georgia could repair one in Normandy without seeing a manual. A spare part manufactured in Detroit fit a truck in Tunisia and a truck in the Philippines, identically. The American system was designed from the beginning for mass production, mass maintenance, and mass replacement. Let that production number sit for a moment. 562,000 of a single model of truck. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, produced roughly 347,000 trucks and 226,000 automobiles total across the entire war. All makes, all models, all types combined. The Americans built more copies of one truck than Germany built of everything with an engine and 4 or more wheels. The Jeep, the quarter-ton four-wheel drive utility vehicle that became the universal symbol of American military mobility, was produced by two companies working from the same standardized design. Willys Overland built about 360,000, Ford built about 280,000. The combined total of 626,727 was so large that the Americans shipped roughly a third of them overseas to the British and the Soviets under Lend-Lease. They could afford to give away more than 200,000 Jeeps and still have more than enough for every unit in their own army. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who lived with the infantry and wrote about what he saw, described the Jeep as doing everything and going everywhere. Soldiers used it for reconnaissance, for command, for evacuation of the wounded, for laying communications wire, for towing anti-tank guns, and in one famous incident, for ploughing a French farmer's field because the farmer's horses had been killed by artillery fire. The vehicle that really changed the war at the tactical level, the one that German soldiers watched roll past with disbelief, was the Deuce and a Half. It could carry 2.5 tons of cargo, or a full squad of 12 soldiers with their equipment. It could haul an anti-tank gun. It could serve as an ambulance. It could be fitted with a ring mount for a 50 caliber machine gun. It ran on gasoline, which the American logistical system delivered in seemingly endless quantities, and it was everywhere. Not just in the rear areas, not just at supply depots, right at the front, right at the company and platoon level, organic to the units doing the fighting. According to the official United States Army Tables of Organization and Equipment, a standard infantry regiment in 1944 was authorized roughly 140 to 150 Jeeps. Under the 1943 Armored Division Table of Organization, an armored division had 449 Jeeps, alongside its 168 Sherman medium tanks. The standard infantry division of about 14,250 men was motorized in every element except the infantry rifle companies themselves, and even those could be moved in bounds by shuttling. Trucks carrying one load of men forward, dropping them, and then returning for the next group. Consider what this meant at the level of the individual soldier. An American platoon leader had a Jeep. He could drive to the company command post, get his orders, and drive back to his men in 20 minutes. His German counterpart walked, or if he was lucky, rode a bicycle. An American battalion aid station had jeeps and ambulances that could evacuate a wounded man to a field hospital 30 miles to the rear in under an hour. A German wounded soldier was loaded onto a horse-drawn wagon that bounced over shell-cratered roads at 3 miles an hour, a journey that could take most of a day, and that killed men whose wounds might have been survivable with faster evacuation. An American artillery forward observer had a jeep with a radio mounted in it. He could drive to a hilltop, call in coordinates, and relocate before the enemy could respond to his transmission. His German equivalent lugged his radio on foot, set it up, transmitted, and prayed he could pack it and move before the counter-battery fire arrived. At the company level, the difference was even more pronounced. An American rifle company commander could call for an ammunition resupply and have trucks deliver it to a road junction behind his position within hours. A German company commander sent a runner back to the battalion's supply point with a written request, and the ammunition came forward on a horse-drawn cart, if the horses had not been killed, if the road was passable, if the cart had not broken an axle. In the hedgerow fighting in Normandy, American rifle companies were resupplied with ammunition, water, and rations every night by truck. German companies in the same battle sometimes went 2 or 3 days between resupply because the horse-drawn wagons could not navigate the narrow lanes under fire. To move an entire American infantry division simultaneously with all of its equipment required substantial reinforcement from pooled quartermaster truck companies, each typically operating 48 deuce-and-a-half trucks. Moving one full division at once could require nearly 300 additional trucks beyond the division's own organic transport. The Army even experimented in 1942 with a fully motorized infantry division that had almost 3,000 vehicles built into its structure, more than 1,000 more than a standard infantry division. It abandoned the concept only because the shipping tonnage required to get that many vehicles across the Atlantic was too great. Instead, the Army pooled trucks at the Army level, where they could motorize any infantry division at will, anywhere, on a few hours' notice. No army in history had ever fielded this density of organic motor transport at the small unit level, and the German army, despite its fearsome reputation for mechanized warfare, had nothing remotely close. Here is the fact that contradicts almost everything popular culture has taught people about the Wehrmacht. The German army that conquered Poland, France, the Low Countries, Norway, Yugoslavia, Greece, and pushed to the gates of Moscow and the banks of the Volga was not a mechanized army. It was a horse-drawn army with a thin mechanized tip. The tip is what the cameras filmed. According to accounts of Goebbels' propaganda directives, only mechanized traffic was to be shown in newsreels. The horses were kept out of the picture Germany presented to the world. The numbers are devastating. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, the Wehrmacht employed roughly 514,000 horses. Over the course of the entire war, the German military used an estimated 2,750,000 horses and mules. At any given time, the average number of horses in service was about 1,100,000. As late as February of 1945, with the Reich collapsing on all fronts, the Wehrmacht still had 1,060,000 horses in the army alone, plus another 37,000 in the Luftwaffe and another 1,500 in the navy. A standard German infantry division carried approximately 5,300 horses, 1,100 horse-drawn vehicles, and only about 950 motor vehicles. By 1943, the supply train of a typical German infantry division relied on just 256 trucks, with the remaining logistics burden carried by over 2,600 horses. The proportion of German divisions that were fully motorized or mechanized was shockingly small. In November of 1944, out of 264 German divisions in the field, only 42 were armored or mechanized. That is roughly 16%. The other 84% were foot infantry hauling their supplies and weapons behind horse teams that moved at a walking pace. Historian Karl-Heinz Frieser, in his landmark study of the 1940 campaign, wrote plainly that the image of the German Blitzkrieg army is a figment of propaganda imagination. According to accounts of Nazi propaganda practice, the ministry ensured that newsreels showed only mechanized columns. The horses were kept off camera. And the horses were not merely slow. They were a logistical catastrophe in ways that trucks were not. A truck that ran out of fuel could sit idle without consuming anything. A horse that ran out of feed died. And unlike fuel, which could be stored indefinitely in a jerrycan, hay rotted in the rain, grain spoiled in damp storage, and the entire fodder chain was vulnerable to the same mud and weather that was slowing the animals that depended on it. The feed had to be procured from the countryside or shipped from Germany, stored in depots, and hauled forward, often by more horse-drawn wagons that were themselves consuming more fodder in transit. It was a cascading supply problem with no mechanical solution. Horses got sick, horses went lame, horses died. In the 2 months of December 1941 and January 1942 alone, the Wehrmacht lost 179,000 horses on the Eastern Front. Over the entire war, an estimated 1.5 million German military horses were killed or died of exhaustion, disease, and starvation. And unlike a deuce and a half, which the factories in Pontiac could replace in a matter of hours, a dead horse took years to breed, train, and condition for military service. The consequences were devastating in situations of encirclement. When the Sixth Army was surrounded at Stalingrad, it had sent most of its horses to the rear before the Soviet ring closed. Without horses, its artillery could not be repositioned. Guns that could not be moved could not be withdrawn and could not support a breakout. In the Demyansk pocket, 20,000 horses were trapped, along with 95,000 men. The Luftwaffe transport aircraft that should have been carrying ammunition, medicine, and food for the soldiers were instead hauling bales of hay and oats for the horses. Every cargo flight devoted to feeding horses was a flight that was not feeding men. This was not a secret to the German High Command. They knew. They had known since before the war began that their infantry divisions were not mechanized, and they understood the disadvantage this created. But Germany simply did not have the industrial base to close the gap. The German automobile industry in the 1930s was a fraction of the size of its American counterpart. While America had 27 million cars on its roads, Germany had fewer than a million. The Volkswagen program was supposed to change that. Hitler laid the foundation stone for the KDF Stadt factory near Fallersleben in 1938, the plant that would later be known as Wolfsburg. Ferdinand Porsche designed the car. A savings stamp scheme was launched, and roughly 336,000 German citizens made regular payments toward a vehicle they were promised would cost 990 Reichsmarks. Not a single civilian Volkswagen was ever delivered. When war broke out in 1939, the KDF factory was converted to military production. It built the Kubelwagen light utility vehicle and the Schwimmwagen amphibious car, both useful vehicles, but both produced in numbers that would barely register against American output. The Opel Blitz, Germany's primary medium truck, was ironically based on a General Motors commercial design. Since General Motors had taken a majority stake in Opel in 1929 and gained full ownership by 1931, even this truck was never produced in sufficient volume. Germany built the Autobahn, the finest highway network in Europe, and never built the vehicles to fill it. The deeper problem was cultural as much as industrial. In America, the car was an ordinary possession, a farmer's tool, a salesman's office, a teenager's first taste of freedom. In Germany, the automobile remained a luxury for the professional classes. The average German soldier drafted in 1940 had likely never driven a car in his life. The average American soldier drafted that same year had likely been driving since he was 14. This meant that the American army could put almost any recruit behind the wheel of a truck with minimal additional training. The German army had to teach most of its conscripts to drive from scratch, a process that consumed weeks of instruction the accelerating war could not spare. The disparity showed itself first in North Africa. When German and Italian forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel fought across Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt, the supply situation was a constant crisis. Rommel repeatedly advanced beyond the reach of his truck columns, which were a hodgepodge of German, Italian, captured French, and captured British vehicles, each type requiring different spare parts that were nearly impossible to obtain in the desert. Martin van Creveld, the military logistics historian, documented in detail how Rommel's forces were chronically unable to sustain forward operations because the trucks simply could not bring enough fuel and ammunition forward fast enough. The German supply columns were also brutally vulnerable to British air attack across the open terrain. When American forces arrived in North Africa in late 1942 and began accumulating supplies for the Tunisian campaign, the sheer volume of American materiel stunned captured German and Italian soldiers. To walk into a captured American supply depot was to enter a world that bore no resemblance to the German logistical experience. Canned rations, stacked in quantities, a German quartermaster would consider a fantasy. Ammunition in crates stretching to the horizon. Spare tires, engine parts, oil filters, fan belts, radiator hoses, all catalogued and boxed and available on demand. And trucks. Always more trucks. Rows of them parked in depots with spare engines sitting on pallets beside them. The American system did not just move supplies, it overwhelmed the operational space with them. General Guenther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff of the German Fourth Army, described the reality of the Eastern Front in testimony recorded by British military historian B. H. Liddell Hart. Speaking of the autumn of 1941, as the Wehrmacht pushed toward Moscow, Blumentritt said that the infantryman slithers in the mud while many teams of horses are needed to drag each gun forward. He said all wheeled vehicles sink up to their axles in the slime, and that a large portion of their heavy artillery was soon stuck fast. This was the army, the newsreels told the world, was an unstoppable mechanized juggernaut. When the roads turned to mud, the Germans were moving at the same speed. Armies had moved in the Napoleonic Wars. Meanwhile, the Americans had not a single horse in their entire army in Europe, not one. The United States Army had opted for all truck logistics from the very beginning of its military reform in 1940. The horse had been simply eliminated from the American order of battle and replaced with rubber tires and gasoline engines. If your father or grandfather served in the Second World War, in any branch, in any theatre, I would be honored to hear their story in the comments. What unit did they serve in? Where were they stationed? What did they remember about how they got from place to place, about the trucks, about the roads, about the cold? Those details, the small, specific, personal things, are the real record of what happened, and they deserve to be preserved by the families who carry them. To understand how much the truck advantage mattered in actual combat, you need to see it operating at its most extreme, and the most extreme example is one of the least glamorous operations of the entire war. It had no tanks, no fighter planes, no dramatic charges. It had trucks, drivers, and mud, and it sustained the liberation of Western Europe. On August 25, 1944, a system went into operation in northern France that would become the single greatest demonstration of motorized logistics in military history. It was called the Red Ball Express. It was named for the railroad term for express priority freight, and it ran like a railroad on highways. The problem it was designed to solve was this. After the breakout from the Normandy hedgerows in late July, American armies had advanced so fast they outran their supply lines. General George Patton's Third Army was racing across France at speeds that sometimes reached 75 miles in a single day. First and Third Armies were each consuming as much as 400,000 gallons of gasoline every day. An infantry division needed roughly 150 tons of supplies in every 24-hour period. An armored division needed 350 tons. The port of Cherbourg was hundreds of miles behind the front lines, and the French railroad system had been obliterated by Allied bombing before D-Day. The supplies were there. They were sitting in depots on the Normandy coast. The frontline armies needed them desperately. Between the depots and the front was nothing but road. Somebody had to drive the supplies forward. And the somebody turned out to be roughly 23,000 men, operating up to 5,958 vehicles on a dedicated one-way loop of French highways. The plan was conceived in a 36-hour planning session by Brigadier General Ewart G. Planck, who declared that it would never be said that a lack of supplies stopped Patton when the Germans could not. Colonel Loren Albert Ayers, nicknamed Little Patton by the men who served under him, was charged with finding 2 drivers for every truck so the convoys could run around the clock. The route stretched from the Normandy beaches and Cherbourg forward to supply depots near the front lines. A northern loop for delivery, a southern loop for the return. A round trip covered nearly 400 miles and took about 54 hours. The official top speed was 25 miles per hour, though drivers routinely disabled the governors on their trucks and pushed well past 50 miles per hour because the front was running out of everything. The Red Ball Express ran for 82 days, from August 25 to November 16, 1944. At its peak, it was delivering roughly 12,500 tons of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment in a single day to the forward depots. Over its entire life, the system moved more than 412,000 tons of supplies. Corporal Charles H. Johnson of the 783rd Military Police Battalion is the soldier in the famous photograph from September 5, 1944, waving a convoy through near Alencon, the image that became the visual symbol of the entire operation. And here is the part of the story that most history books either bury in a footnote or skip entirely. Approximately 73% of the truck companies operating in the motor transport service of the European Theatre of Operations were African American. Roughly 3/4 of all Red Ball Express soldiers were black men, driving through the night, often under artillery, fire and air attack, in a segregated army that denied them the full rights of the country they were bleeding for. A tank driver from the 5th Armored Division described it plainly. He said, "If it was not for the Red Ball, we could not have moved." He said they were all black drivers, and they delivered in the heat of combat, and that his men in their tanks would be praying for them to come up. An armored division commander said the black drivers delivered gasoline under constant fire, and said he would not want their job, that they had what it takes. One of those drivers was James D. Rookard. He later recalled the pace of those weeks. He said, "When General Patton said, 'For you to be there, you were there if you had to drive all day and all night.' Those trucks just kept running. They would break down, we would fix them, and they would run again." Another driver, Washington Rector of the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company, remembered the contradiction of serving in a segregated military. He said, "You accepted discrimination. We were warned not to fraternize with whites, for fear problems would arise." These men, whose names are mostly absent from the monuments, were the human engine of the most decisive logistical advantage of the entire war. Without them, Patton's advance stalls at the Meuse. Without them, the liberation of Paris is delayed by weeks. Without them, the war in Europe costs more lives and lasts longer. Colonel John S. D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander's son, argued directly that without the Red Ball drivers, the advance across France could not have been made. General Patton himself understood what was sustaining his advance. He reportedly said that the 2.5-ton truck was his most valuable weapon. Not the Sherman tank, not the P-51 Mustang, not the artillery, the truck. The Red Ball Express was the most famous logistical operation of the war, but it was not the only one. As the front moved east, new convoy systems were established. The White Ball Express began running in early October of 1944 from the ports of Le Havre and Rouen to Paris. The Red Lion Express and others followed. Each one was built on the same principle: dedicated highway loops, trucks running around the clock, drivers pushing themselves and their machines past the point of mechanical endurance. And it worked. Not elegantly, not efficiently by peacetime standards, but it worked well enough to sustain the fastest sustained ground advance in the history of warfare to that point. The contrast with the German supply system during the same period could not have been sharper. As the Wehrmacht retreated eastward through France in August and September of 1944, its infantry divisions marched on foot at roughly 15 miles a day. Their artillery, still horse-drawn, moved even slower. German units that were bypassed by American spearheads often could not retreat fast enough to avoid encirclement because their supply columns moved at the pace of a walking horse. In the Falaise pocket alone, the wreckage of German horse-drawn transport was so dense that aerial photographs showed roads literally blocked by the carcasses of dead horses and the splintered remains of wagons. An American armored spearhead during Operation Cobra could cover 75 miles in a single day. The German infantry divisions it was chasing needed 5 days to cover the same distance. That arithmetic alone explains why the German army in France disintegrated so rapidly after the breakout. It was not that the German soldiers stopped fighting. Many fought with desperate skill. It was that they could not move fast enough to establish a new defensive line before the Americans, riding in their trucks, had already driven past it. While the Red Ball Express was feeding the American advance in France, another fleet of American trucks was doing something even more strategically significant 6,000 miles to the east. And the irony of this part of the story is so bitter it deserves its own monument. American Studebaker trucks were winning the war for the Soviet Union. The The Studebaker US-6 was a 2.5-ton six-wheel drive truck built at the Studebaker factory in South Bend, Indiana. It was produced primarily for export under Lend-Lease. Total production reached 219,882 vehicles. Studebaker built 197,678 of them. REO Motors in Lansing, Michigan, built another 22,204. The vast majority went to the Soviet Union, where Red Army soldiers nicknamed the truck the Studer and the King of the Roads. When the war ended, approximately one-third of all vehicles in the Red Army had been provided through American Lend-Lease, but the Studebaker did something beyond hauling cargo. It became the standard mount for the BM-13N Katyusha rocket launcher, the weapon the Germans called Stalin's organ for the terrifying shriek of its massed salvos. Thousands of Katyusha launchers were mounted on American truck chassis. The rockets that shattered German defensive positions at Kursk, at the Dnieper crossings, at Operation Bagration, at the gates of Berlin were launched from the back of trucks built in Indiana by workers who had never heard of the places where their machines would fight. The Studebaker chassis gave the Katyusha something it could not have had on a horse-drawn carriage or a less reliable Soviet-produced vehicle. It gave it survivability through mobility. A Katyusha battery mounted on Studebakers could fire a full salvo of 16 132mm rockets in roughly 7 to 10 seconds, then be packed and moving within minutes, relocating to a new firing position before the German counter-battery fire could arrive. This shoot-and-move cycle, repeated thousands of times across the Eastern Front, was a direct tactical advantage provided not by Soviet ingenuity alone, though that was considerable, but by American manufacturing capacity. The rockets were Soviet, the launcher frames were Soviet, the trucks that carried them and kept them alive were American. The broader scope of Lend-Lease went far beyond the Studebaker. The United States shipped more than 400,000 jeeps and trucks combined to the Soviet Union during the war. It sent about 2,000 locomotives and 11,000 freight cars. The total Lend-Lease package to the Soviets also included over 35,000 radio sets and about half the railroad rails the Soviet Union laid during the entire conflict. Soviet leaders acknowledged the debt with unusual candor. Nikita Khrushchev wrote in his memoirs that, if the United States had not helped, the Soviets would not have won the war. He wrote that one-on-one against Hitler's Germany, they would not have withstood its onslaught and would have lost. Of the trucks specifically, Khrushchev asked his readers to imagine how the Red Army would have advanced from Stalingrad to Berlin without them. He said their losses would have been colossal because they would have had no maneuverability. Joseph Stalin reportedly told the Allied leaders at the Tehran Conference in 1943 that the most important things in this war are the machines, and that the United States was a country of machines. He reportedly added that without the machines received through Lend-Lease, they would have lost the war. The irony is structural and it is total. The Soviet offensives of 1944 and 1945 that crushed the Wehrmacht from the east rode partly on American trucks built in Indiana. The German army those trucks were helping to destroy was still pulling its guns with horses. The country that promised every citizen a people's car never delivered a single one to a civilian buyer. The country that built the Model T delivered enough trucks to motorize two Allied armies on opposite sides of the world at the same time. Hitler built the Autobahn, the finest highway system in Europe. He never built the vehicles to fill it. And the roads themselves became instruments of Germany's destruction, because when American and Soviet armies rolled onto the Autobahn in 1945, they moved faster on German roads than the Wehrmacht ever had. The moment when the American motorization advantage became most visible and most decisive was the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944. When the German Ardennes offensive broke through on December 16, the 101st Airborne Division was in reserve at a camp near Reims, France, refitting after the costly fighting in the Netherlands. The division had no organic motor transport of its own. It was an airborne unit designed to arrive by parachute and glider. But on the evening of December 17, the division was alerted, and within hours, trucks were being assembled from across the rear area. On December 18, the entire division loaded onto open-air trucks and drove over 107 miles through freezing darkness to the crossroads town of Bastogne, Belgium, a place none of them had heard of 12 hours earlier. The men rode standing up in the back of the trucks, because the roads were icy and sitting down meant frostbite. They had no winter clothing. Many had no ammunition beyond what they carried in their pockets, but they had trucks, and the trucks got them there. The leading elements arrived roughly 4 hours ahead of the leading German forces. 4 hours. That was the margin between holding Bastogne and losing it. If the Americans had needed to march on foot, as every German infantry division in the Ardennes would have had to, Bastogne would have been in German hands before the first American paratrooper arrived. The defense of the most strategically important crossroads in the Ardennes, the road junction the entire German offensive needed to capture to reach the Meuse River and ultimately Antwerp, was made possible by a fleet of borrowed trucks driven through the night by exhausted men who did not know where they were going until they got there. Once inside the perimeter, the defenders held for 8 days against 3 German corps. The acting division commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, famously responded to a German surrender ultimatum with a single word, but the defense itself rested on something less dramatic and far more important than one general's defiance. It rested on the fact that American supply trucks had brought enough ammunition, enough medical supplies, and enough rations into Bastogne before the ring closed to sustain the garrison until relief arrived. The Germans surrounding Bastogne had no equivalent logistical depth. Their ammunition was rationed. Their fuel was running out. Their wounded were dying in aid stations that had no morphine because the horse-drawn supply wagons carrying medical supplies were stuck on roads 20 miles to the east. The siege lasted until December 26, when the 4th Armoured Division, spearheaded by a Sherman tank called Cobra King commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggis, broke through from Patton's Third Army. That breakthrough was itself a feat of motorized maneuver the German army could not have replicated. Patton wheeled 3 full divisions, 90 degrees north, in winter conditions in under 48 hours. The operation consumed hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel and thousands of tons of ammunition, requiring a logistical staff that could plan and execute a major redeployment faster than the enemy could react to it. Patton's logistics officer, Colonel Walter J. Muller, ran a group the staff called Legendary Scavengers, who hijacked supply convoys, impersonated officers from other units, and raided every depot within reach to keep the Third Army fueled and armed. When Patton's 12th Corps captured 100,000 gallons of German gasoline at Chalons, it kept an entire corps rolling for another day. This was not the first time Patton's army had pushed American motorized logistics to its breaking point. 3 months earlier, in September of 1944, the Third Army had been racing across France so fast that it consumed fuel faster than the Red Ball Express could deliver it. On one occasion, the Third Army requested 400,000 gallons of gasoline and received roughly 32,000, less than a tenth of what it needed. The advance stalled at the Moselle River. But even in that crisis, the American system improvised. Patton's men drained every abandoned vehicle they could find. They captured German fuel stocks. They received emergency aerial resupply drops. And when the fuel began flowing again, they moved forward so fast that the German defenders could not construct defensive positions quickly enough to stop them. The fuel crisis of September 1944 was real, and it was serious. But it was the crisis of an army moving too fast, not the crisis of an army unable to move at all. The German army's logistical failures were the opposite kind entirely. The contrast with the German side is devastating. The entire Ardennes offensive was premised on capturing American fuel depots to sustain the advance, because Germany did not have enough fuel for its own panzer divisions to reach their objectives on the Meuse River. When those fuel dumps were not captured, and when the weather cleared enough for Allied aircraft to hit the German columns, the offensive collapsed. Panzer divisions ran dry. Infantry divisions on foot could not keep pace, and the horses pulling the artillery through the frozen forest could not be fed because the fodder wagons could not get through the roads clogged with retreating traffic. The German Ardennes offensive was defeated not by a single battle but by a mathematical impossibility. The Wehrmacht was trying to fight a mobile war with a largely immobile army against an enemy that could move men, ammunition, fuel, food, and reinforcements faster than the Germans could march. After the war, when military historians began examining what actually decided the outcome in Europe, the picture that emerged was not the one the public expected. It was not primarily about wonder weapons or individual heroism, though there had been plenty of both. It was about logistics. It was about trucks. Martin van Creveld, in his landmark 1977 study of military logistics titled Supplying War, argued that the American military operated its supply system with the precision and scale of General Motors at its peak. Van Creveld documented how the American approach concentrated overwhelming mass at the decisive point, and how the characteristically American habit of improvising when the formal plan broke down made the system resilient in ways that no amount of German doctrinal precision could match. The truck was the instrument that made both the planning and the improvisation possible. A detailed supply schedule could use trucks to deliver precise tonnages to precise locations on precise timelines. And when the schedule collapsed, as it always did in combat, the same trucks could be redirected, rerouted, and repurposed on the initiative of individual drivers and company commanders who understood the vehicle they were operating because they had spent their civilian lives operating ones just like it. Van Creveld also made a point that cuts to the heart of the German failure. He noted that the German military tradition prioritized operations, the art of maneuver, above logistics, and the science of supply. German staff officers were trained to view logistics as a subordinate function, a service to be provided to the fighting arms rather than the foundation on which the fighting arms depended. American staff officers, trained in a tradition that owed as much to the railroads and the automobile industry as it did to military theory, viewed logistics as the first problem to be solved, not the last. The German approach produced brilliant tactical victories followed by logistical collapse. The American approach produced logistical certainty followed by operational freedom. Over the course of a 6-year war, the second approach proved more durable than the first. The contemporary press grasped the significance even while the war was still being fought. Time magazine, reporting on the supply operations that sustained the American advance across France, called it the miracle of supply. The magazine wrote that this miracle was in the American tradition, a tradition the Germans have never really understood. Time wrote that it was begotten of a people accustomed to great spaces, to transcontinental railways, to nationwide trucking chains, to endless roads and millions of automobiles. That passage was written in 1944. The magazine was identifying in real time the connection between America's civilian automotive culture and its military dominance, the exact phenomenon that German officers along the Western Front could see but could not comprehend. The German officers themselves, when captured and debriefed, kept circling back to the same theme with an almost obsessive frequency. The bugged conversations at Trent Park, the manor house in North London where British intelligence held senior German prisoners without telling them the rooms were wired for sound, reveal this pattern across thousands of pages of transcripts. The operation was one of the most remarkable intelligence coups of the war. The prisoners were given comfortable quarters, good food, chess sets, and the freedom to walk the gardens. They believed they were in a gentlemanly captivity. What they did not know was that British intelligence officers, many of them German Jewish refugees who had fled the Nazi regime, were sitting in a basement beneath the house, transcribing every conversation the generals had with each other, day and night, for years. Historian Sönke Neitzel, who published the Trent Park generals' transcripts in his book Tapping Hitler's Generals, documented that German soldiers consistently attributed American battlefield success to material superiority. The term recurred obsessively in the conversations. They found the American material abundance almost incomprehensible. Neitzel highlighted a revealing word that appeared again and again. The German officers called the American advantage unfair. They had been trained all their lives to believe that superior tactics, superior leadership, and superior fighting spirit could overcome any material disadvantage. The rivers of trucks and jeeps and ammunition and fuel flowing toward the American front lines were proof that this belief had been catastrophically wrong, and they could not bring themselves to accept it. Because accepting it meant admitting that the war they had been fighting and the doctrine they had spent their careers mastering had been rendered irrelevant by a country that simply built more trucks than anyone else on earth. Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, captured in Tunisia in 1943 and held at Trent Park for the remainder of the war, is recorded disparaging American troops as soldiers, even while conceding the overwhelming material gap. This was the recurring pattern in the transcripts. The German officers could not bring themselves to admit that the trucks were a form of military superiority equal to or greater than the tactical excellence they valued above all else. They treated logistics as something beneath real soldiering, a mechanical advantage, a trick of wealth, not a legitimate way to win a war. Their doctrine, their training, their entire professional identity told them that wars were won by the man with the better plan and the sharper sword. The Americans were winning with the better truck, and the German officers at Trent Park found this almost philosophically offensive. The American commanders, by contrast, had no such confusion. They understood perfectly well what was winning the war for them. General Omar Bradley placed heavy emphasis on logistics in his operational planning, ensuring supply lines were secured before committing to offensive action. And the American Officer Corps, built from the same civilian population that had been driving and repairing vehicles for a generation, treated the truck not as a support tool, but as a weapons system as important as any tank or artillery piece in the inventory. The Americans, who had been raised in a country of trucks and highways and filling stations and roadside mechanics, treated logistics as the foundation on which everything else rested. And that difference in philosophy was not a wartime invention. It was a cultural inheritance stretching back to the Transcontinental Railroad, to the mail order catalog, to the Model T, to the entire American experience of moving things across vast distances as a daily habit rather than a special undertaking. The verdict on the logistical contest between the United States and Germany in the Second World War is not close. It is not a matter of interpretation or national perspective. It is arithmetic, and the arithmetic is overwhelming. The United States produced roughly 2,400,000 military trucks. Germany produced roughly 347,000. The United States produced over 600,000 jeeps. Germany produced none. The United States sent enough trucks to the Soviet Union to motorize a third of the Red Army while simultaneously motorizing its own forces in Europe and the Pacific. Germany lost an estimated 1.5 million horses over the course of the war and could never replace them fast enough because breeding and training a draft horse takes years while building a truck takes hours. The United States had 0 horses in its European army. Germany still had over 1 million horses in uniform in February of 1945, 3 months before the surrender. An American infantry division could move 30 miles in a day by truck shuttle. A German infantry division could march about 15 miles on a good road, fewer in mud, fewer in snow, fewer when the horses had not been fed, which by 1944 was most of the time. An American armored column during Operation Cobra averaged 75 miles per day for days on end. A German infantry division chasing it would need a week to cover the same ground. That gap, repeated across 1,000 roads on 1,000 days, is the gap that lost the war for Germany in the West. None of this diminishes the German soldier as a fighter. Man for man, the average Wehrmacht infantryman was a skilled, experienced, and dangerous opponent. German tactical doctrine was sophisticated. German small unit leadership was often superb. But tactical excellence means nothing if you cannot get your men to the battle in time, if your ammunition arrives a day late because the horses pulling the wagon train collapsed in the mud, if your reserves are marching on foot toward a crisis that a motorized enemy reached 6 hours ago. The German army could win any fight it could get to. It increasingly could not get there. Every German soldier who watched an American column roll past that autumn and winter, riding in trucks while his own division marched on foot, was not witnessing a single military advantage. He was witnessing the accumulated industrial capacity of a nation that had been mass-producing motor vehicles for 3 decades, driven by men who had been operating engines since childhood, sustained by a logistical philosophy that treated the truck not as a luxury, but as the baseline tool of modern warfare. Where do they get all those trucks? That was the question German soldiers kept asking. The answer was Highland Park, Michigan, 1913, where the first moving assembly line began producing Model T Fords at a rate that would reshape the world. The answer was River Rouge, Detroit, Flint, Pontiac, South Bend, Toledo, and Lansing. The answer was every Ford dealership in every small town, every Chevrolet garage on every county road, and every dirt lane in Kansas where a 16-year-old boy learned to double-clutch a flatbed before he learned to shave. The answer was a country that had been building the Army's most important weapon for a full generation before the Army ever knew it would need one, and the Army never had to ask for it. The factories were already there, the drivers were already trained, the mechanics already knew how to keep the engines running, and the proof was not written in any single battle. It was carried in the bed of a 2.5-ton truck, bouncing down a French road in the November rain, with 12 soldiers in the back and a 19-year-old driver from Ohio behind the wheel. A kid who had never fired his rifle in combat, but who had driven a delivery truck for his father's hardware store since he was 15, and who knew how to back a trailer in the dark and patch a radiator hose with electrical tape. A kid who was, in his own quiet and entirely undecorated way, the reason the war ended when it did. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it keeps these stories visible. The stories of the men who drove through the night, and the men who built the trucks on the assembly lines, and the horses that died by the hundreds of thousands in a war that had already passed them by. Subscribe if you want the next investigation. There are many of these stories still to tell, stories about the ordinary machinery and the ordinary men that decided the outcome of the largest war in human history. They deserve to be remembered not for the battles they fought, but for the miles they covered, through the mud, through the dark, all the way to the end.